My name is Catherine Cornell, and in name of my colleagues in the Department of Theology here at Boston College and the School of Theology and Ministry, I want to welcome you all to this year's Brian O'Brien and Mary HASTEN lecture or panel on interreligious dialogue. Each year we invite an important voice in the area of interreligious dialogue to speak to us on topics that are relevant for all of us. And this year we are focusing on signs of hope in Muslim-Christian relationship. The relationship between Islam and Christianity may seem particularly tense in our times, not only in the Middle East, but also in Europe, the United States, and other parts of the world. Our understanding of this relationship is almost entirely shaped by news reporting on acts of violence and terrorism, and by controversies surrounding migration and integration. This may lead to a sense of despair or hopelessness about the possibility of peaceful coexistence and collaboration between Muslims and Christians. Islam and Christianity are the two largest religions in the world, and peace in the world really does hinge on the relationship between these two major religious traditions. I think it's therefore essential that we counter the dominant narrative of hostility and tension between Christians and Muslims with different stories, stories of friendship, of mutual support and collaboration, and of reciprocal inspiration. And this is why this evening we want to focus on something positive, namely signs of hope in Muslim-Christian relations. And we have brought together an exceptional panel of scholars who have been deeply involved in this topic for many years and in different parts of the world. I will introduce them in turn, and then they will come up to the podium and speak one after the other. Our first speaker is Joshua Ralston. Joshua is a professor or lecturer in Muslim-Christian relations at the School of Divinity at Edinburgh University in the United Kingdom. His work is concerned with theological, legal, political, and scriptural encounters between Christians and Muslims across the centuries, with a particular focus on Protestant Christianity and Sunni Islam. He approaches these questions from an interdisciplinary perspective that draws on political theology, Islamic studies, Christian theology, critical theory, migration studies, and comparative theology. And as you will hear this evening, Professor Ralston is also particularly involved in both scholarly and practical involvement in questions of migration in Europe. So we look forward to hearing from him. Our second speaker comes from Germany, from the University of Paderborn. His name is Professor Klaus Von Stosch. He's head of the Center of Comparative Theology and Cultural Studies at Paderborn University. He has been instrumental in developing the area of comparative theology in Germany and has himself focused mainly on the relationship between Christianity and Islam. For many years, his center and university has hosted students from Muslim-majority countries who come to study at Paderborn, and conversely, he takes German students to centers of Islamic learning in Iran to immerse themselves in Islamic studies for extended periods of time. This year, I just found out Professor Von Stosch received the World Award for Book of the Year from Iran, from the hands, no less, of President Rouhani. So in his welcoming, or in his thank you speech, Professor Von Stosch mentioned that the book honors all those who support an emancipated Islam. And finally, we have, last but not least, Professor Dan Madigan, who is an Australian Jesuit who teaches at Georgetown University and focuses also on the relationship between Christianity and Islam. He is the Ruesch family Distinguished Jesuit Scholar at Georgetown University. He also is affiliated at Georgetown University with the Prince Al-Wahid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Relations. And prior to going to Georgetown, Professor Madigan founded and directed the Institute for the Study of Religions and Cultures at the Gregorian University in Rome. Professor Madigan has been instrumental, very deeply involved in the Building Bridges seminar, which brings together each year Muslims and Christians to speak and enter into conversation about common theological and social question. And this year was the 17th iteration of the Building Bridges seminar, and it focused on a world of inequalities. Professor Madigan has published widely in the area of Muslim-Christian relations, and his particular interest is on the study of the Quran itself and the interpretation of the Quran in the history of Islam and in Muslim-Christian relations. So I hope you realize what an outstanding panel we have here tonight, and together let us welcome our panelists to this evening.
Let me begin by thanking Professor Corneille for the invitation and for all of you for coming out, whether it was a requirement for the majority of you or for the few of you that actually elected to be here. What I'd like to do today is give you a brief snapshot of some of the ways that various forms of Christianity and Islam are encountering one another on the borders of Europe. I'm not sure it will be signs of hope, but at the very least, it will be signs of resilience and possibility. Missed that slide. In September of 2015, Pope Francis called on every parish in Europe to welcome migrants and refugees into their homes. English churches organized to cross the channel to the Calais jungle to provide food and housing and share in the Eucharistic meal. Germans met at train stations and at a Bundesliga match to say that refugees were welcome. In the autumn of 2015, churches, synagogues, mosques were turned into makeshift shelters and homes, as somewhere between 600,000 and 1.1 million migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers made their way across the Mediterranean Sea or the Aegean to seek an alternative possibility from the wars and rumors of wars that marked the reality in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and more. Of course, these weren't the only signs and responses to this change in Europe. Train stations in Budapest became sites of rivalry and violence. The border in Greece and Macedonia was eventually closed that winter. Politicians, from Nigel Farage in the UK to Viktor Orban in Hungary to our president here, Donald Trump, saw the influx of asylum seekers as a threat to Western civilization. And central to this conversation was the relationship between Islam, Christianity, and political secularism. Orban is one example of many of those who argued that the influx of people seeking new life was a threat to Christian culture and to the European roots of secularism and Judeo-Christian values. What was once maybe only on the far right has now become a mainstream reality across much of Europe, North America, and actually also other Middle Eastern countries like Lebanon or the Emirates, who see migrants as a threat These pictures were taken by me in Budapest this last April, 3 days after Orbán had been elected for the third time. The stop sign was actually all over the city, on billboards, at bus stops. It's an image from Hungary itself of Syrians entering into Europe with a large stop sign. It was not actually part of his campaign. It was official government propaganda. That was, I'm not exaggerating when I say there were hundreds of them all over Budapest. The very same image Nigel Farage stood in front of as he campaigned for the British exit from Europe. So there was something of a transnational sharing of this anti-migrant sentiment. The other I don't know if it's on your left or right, I can't figure it out right now. The other was simply a makeshift turn to anti-migrant sentiment. And especially anti-Muslim sentiment. It's impossible to think about the rising fear of immigrants in Europe without thinking about the ways in which Islam figures prominently, especially after the attacks in Paris and in Brussels that autumn of 2015. In the light of that, what is there to say about signs of hope, signs of possibility? Over the last 2.5 years, I've had the opportunity of serving on the World Communion of Reformed Churches Task Force on Migration in Europe. This has taken me to Budapest twice, to the Greek-Macedonian border, to Sicily and Lampedusa, to Cologne, Germany, to learn about ways that Christians, Muslims, atheists and anarchists, I'll talk about that in a second, Jews, have worked together to provide an alternative to the culture of fear that has come to dominate Europe. I want to speak briefly, in whatever time I have left, of some of the signs and symbols of Christian-Muslim, and not just Christian-Muslim, human encounters that might give you a possibility of thinking about the world otherwise. I took this picture, again, on the Greek-Macedonian border. If you can read Arabic, it says, "Tomorrow the crossing into a misspelled Europe." I first read it as "Tomorrow the crossing into Aruba," which would have actually maybe been better. What it shows is the ways in which the borders of Europe have actually shifted and hardened over the last few years. Greece, which for so many in these references to Judeo-Christian values, has long been the center or the beginning of Western civilization, that which has given us philosophy and democracy, was now, because of the political decisions, rendered outside of Europe. It was no longer in Schengen where there was free movement. And the refugees themselves noticed this reality. They had made their way across the Aegean, paid for a smuggler, but now found themselves stopped at the border, waiting for their cases to be adjudicated in a country already overrun by its own economic crisis. But within that context, there are signs of hope and resilience, and I just want to point to 4 of them. The first doesn't come from Greece as much as it comes from more secularized, well, Greece is secularized too, but more de-churched parts of Europe. Again and again, over the last 2.5 years, we heard from former members of Christian churches, be they Catholic or Protestant, in Germany or in Sweden or in Scotland, the ways in which they had found the point of the church irrelevant in a secular Europe, that they hadn't stepped foot in a church since their own baptism or the funeral of their parents. And yet, Christian responses to the migration crisis of transforming a church into a site of shelter had brought people back into church, had brought them back into a vision of life marked by engagement, that many people in Germany or Sweden or Scotland who found no use for Christianity or the gospel suddenly found themselves re-energized, because the churches had become places of encounter, places where friendships and stories could be told, not so strongly marked by the politics of various places. And the church had somehow became a site of sanctuary and interreligious engagement. The second story or sign of hope that I'd like to tell you about is the ways in which quiet stories of Christians and Muslims and Jews and atheists coming together to provide human care and attention. So often we think of Christian-Muslim relations as the kinds of things where people like me and a Muslim scholar get together and debate the intricacies of a 13th century text. But more often than not, Christian-Muslim encounter is marked by human care and human engagement at the most basic level. This picture is taken in Lampedusa. I'm a Protestant, so I don't read any Italian. I was told by my Catholic colleague that it says something to the extent of, here is the graves of Christians and Muslims, or Catholics and Muslims, black and white, young and old, male and female, whose lives were lost at sea, seeking another opportunity. It says something different than that, but you get the gist. What this is a tomb and a graveyard on a small island somewhere between Tunisia and the Italian mainline, where Catholics, Protestants, anarchists, and Muslims have come together to buy a graveyard and to bury the remains of people who drowned at sea. And not only that, but to seek out their names and their identities, and to find their loved ones, including allowing them to be reburied through the religious tradition that they're from. They told the story of a young Eritrean woman whose family was able to attend the funeral via Skype, some in Eritrea, some in Sweden, gathered together through technology to care for one another. I'm going over time, so I'll skip that one. Throughout this encounter, which doesn't meet the demands of news media, you see consistent acts of quiet, resilient engagement, of surprising friendship. My own approach to Christian-Muslim relations is marked by what I often call humble particularity, a willingness to engage from the deep tradition of one's own position as a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew, but one that isn't marked by fear, but of openness to the other, of a willingness to allow the questions, perspective, and insights of the other tradition to transform you. That could be theologically, ethically, socially. One of the most powerful realities of this are in the small ways in which Christians and Muslims and others have come together in Europe to resist the image of essential rivalry, of a Christendom and a Dar al-Islam that are inevitably in conflict with one another. Those that fuel and fund the rhetoric both of Muslims and Christians that see no possibility of engagement. Instead, you see opportunities in which people's particular identities become cracked open in moments of sharing. One of the most powerful and profound comes from a small Protestant church on the border of Greece and Macedonia. It's a conservative community, one that felt itself hemmed in by the dominant orthodoxy of Greece, that their own Protestant faith met them a little un-Greek in some ways. They often also found themselves crushed by the economic crisis in Greece, especially in northern Greece, where unemployment was at over 40%. However, in that winter of 2015 and 2016, this small town found that their outskirts had become a makeshift refugee camp, and they were completely unprepared for it. No international NGO was set up in Greece to deal with refugees. That was in Turkey or Kenya or Lebanon or Jordan. And yet, some of the elders of the church said, the gospel requires us to go out, even though we were afraid, even though we knew what had happened in Brussels and Paris. And so some women went out to invite other women to their homes for meals, brought the children in, and the church turned one of its empty buildings into a makeshift apartment. They began offering lessons in Greek and in English. They found lawyers to help adjudicate cases and see if there was any job opportunities. They helped reunite people that had been torn apart. At a dinner the last night, we asked one of the pastors why they had did this. They said, "Let me tell you a story. We are not from here. Our ancestors, our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents are from Pontus on the Black Sea. In 1910 and 1920, when the Ottoman Empire was falling apart, and when Greece and Turkey were becoming modern nation-states, if you were a Greek speaker in Turkey, you were made to flee. And so our grandparents left, and they made their way to Aleppo, where they were given hospitality for 18 months before we were resettled here to Greece. We are simply repaying to the grandchildren of those very same people the hospitality that we had been offered. For does not our scripture say, remember that you too were once an alien and an exile. So be hospitable, treating the alien, the different among you, as if they are one of you."
So thank you so much for the possibility to speak here. I would like to tell you 3 stories which are kinds of stories of hope for me for Muslim-Christian dialogue. One coming from Paderborn, from Qom, and one from Mashhad in Iran. So let's start with Paderborn. That's where I come from. At our university, and in German university in general, you can study theology at public universities. If you decide to study Catholic or Protestant theology at our university, you will have to have some courses in Islam by a Muslim teacher. Because we think that this makes a lot of sense to get a better understanding of Christianity if you learn something on another religion and if you're taught by somebody who challenges you from another religious point of view. So in Paderborn, we have a big Aramaic community, so Christians coming from Syria or Turkey who have an Aramaic background. And some of them study Catholic theology because you cannot study Aramaic theology in Germany. And Catholic theology, they told me, is so near to Aramaic theology, so they decided to study with me. They wanted to do the Catholic study program, but then, as everybody, they were obliged to take a course in Islam from a Muslim. So one of those students came to me and said, okay, it's hard for me already to go to your courses as a Catholic. I would like to go to an Aramaic teacher, but I accept that. But you cannot force me to go to a Muslim. They murdered my grandparents. They murdered all my family. I cannot even talk with them. So, and this was basically all of them were telling me, and that's something what a lot of the Aramaic people in our town are telling at that way. They don't want to meet Muslims, which is kind of dramatic because most of them, the Aramaic and the Muslim, come from Turkey, sometimes even from the same region. But the Aramaic families are somewhat always thinking of the genocide and thinking they wouldn't even speak with the Muslim community. So I told the student, I cannot make an exception for you, you have to go there, but let's make just an attempt. Go just for one evening to a lecture of one of my colleagues, and if you manage to hate her even after the speech, then you are free from going to the course. And I sent her to one of my colleagues who is a very wise old woman, 63 years old. If you look in your eyes, you immediately will only have thoughts of peace in your mind. It's impossible to hate her. So she went there, and the result was clear. She came to me and said, okay, well, I wasn't able to hate her. Maybe she's not the person who murdered my family, but still I don't want to go to those courses. But then, step by step, she agreed to go to a course of one of my Turkish colleagues, Tuba, who is just a few years older than her. And what was interesting, to cut a long story short, what was interesting, after 2 years, now they both are best friends, and the Muslim teacher was invited to have Christmas with the family of her. So they had Christmas together, Aramaic Christmas, and this was the first time that the parents of these Aramaic students talked Turkish again. So they were even able, it was not only a reconciliation between the two girls who are today both doing her PhD with me, one in Aramaic, one in Muslim theology, but it was really a reconciliation of the families, which shows a little bit how academic exchange, purely theological exchange, can help to build bridges and to come together. And it had some very interesting academic results. The Aramaic student, who's now my PhD student, brought many other Aramaic students from other countries to me, and now we have a research focus on comparisons between Aramaic texts from Syriac church fathers with the Quran. And there are some research questions, I don't want to bother you with those questions, but they're so exciting and practically nobody can solve them. But because this community is there now, we can work together in different countries, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Iran, to work on those questions. And it all started with like those two students who became friends and are best friends until today. So I think this is maybe a first good example of what is possible if you, even if you have prejudices, you just listen to the other person, you open your ears, your mind, and maybe your heart, and then in the end you will see that there are a lot of things to share and to learn from each other. My second example is now from Qom in Iran. Qom is the holy city in Iran. You are not allowed to pray there as a Christian. There are no churches. You even are not allowed to play music, even not secular music. No music in the street is possible. You have so many clergymen in one city. I've never seen so many theologians as there. It was really impressive. Every day at another university with thousands of theologians. So it's really a very, very holy Shiite Muslim city. We were there with a group of Christian students and teachers, and we wanted to pray there, which is kind of difficult if it's forbidden in the city. So the Muslims invited us to go to their mosque because it was not allowed to sing outside. So they opened the mosque and we could have our liturgy, our Catholic liturgy, in the prayer room, and we had the guitar and the songs, and even now the Muslim students joined us in prayer and joined singing with us in this mosque in a town where it's not allowed to sing. So in this town, there's a university which is called University of Religions and Denominations, and this is maybe the only university which tries to introduce to Christianity in a way which wants to be objective, which wants to be fair to Christians. So, which is kind of exciting. If you know, in Iran, it's not allowed to use the Bible, to find the Bible in the internet, or to preach or to do missionary work. So it seems to be exciting that there's a university which tries to introduce to Christianity. And they ask us to do this introductory work and would like to hire Christian teachers to do this work, which was difficult. I didn't want to move to Iran, but at least what we are doing now, and this is a very great project for us, is that they develop the teaching materials there. So they get our books, they translate it to Persian, and we teach. We come there, colleagues from me and myself, and we can teach there as if we were teaching to Christian students. So the Shiite students will come and will try to learn and to get Christianity as Christianity understands itself. And 4 of them are now in Paderborn and doing their PhD because they did this program, they learned on Christianity and now doing it in comparative theology. This is a second example, and I just wanted to also mention one name. Wahid is one of those PhD students. When he came to Paderborn, it was the first time that he was outside Iran. It was very hard for him, for example, to see people who drink alcohol. So he told me, well, I saw this girl there. She was drunk. I mean, very drunk. I still don't understand. I try to appreciate, I don't know how. So he learned that as a comparative theologian, you should observe, appreciate everything, try to look, and yeah, there was his personal, and now he's there and seeing something like that nearly every day, and telling weird stories about Germany and Iran, I don't know, and making a great work on Ludwig Wittgenstein, who is my favorite philosopher, and using him for Islamic philosophy. Which brings me to my third example, which is now another city in Iran, Mashhad. So if you have ever been to Rome, you will, I told you, it's a very holy city. It has also very traditional philosophy. The philosophy there is very much shaped by Mullah Sadr, by a scholar from it's from early modernity. And it's what we would like to call a Neoplatonic thinking, what was taught there. If you don't like this school, it's difficult to stay in Rome. Then you go to Mashhad. This is the second important city in holiness, the second one in Iran. It has even a more important imam who's buried there, so there's a lot of holiness also in Mashhad, but it's a very big city. So it's more open-minded in some sense. So in Mashhad, there is a school of separation, as they call it. It wants to separate theology and philosophy, has an autonomous philosophy and use it for theology. And there are a lot of scholars who would be open-minded to learn from also Western philosophy. So in this city, I met Nasreen. This is the third student I would like to present to you. She is an activist for feminist theology and also for eco-rights movement and ecology. So she tries to go always with the bike to everywhere, which is kind of dangerous if you're in Iran, nearly like the United States. In Germany, it's difficult. It's different. Everybody rides with the bike, but no, that's also not true. But okay, so it was really, she was a very activist, and you have to go to the bike. And then one of the preachers decided that it's forbidden for girls to ride with a bike, which is very much against Sharia, against anything in Islamic law. But he simply wanted to get rid of this girl, so he said it's forbidden. Which was kind of hard to be activist for bike rides if you are not allowed to ride on a bike. But this didn't stop her to continue with her activity there. So Nasreen and Rasul, these were the two students which I met there and who I met there and who are now in Paderborn, also doing their PhD. They tried to they participated in a class on comparative theology, and we read an article from Catherine Cornell, because she is, in all the world, people know her as for her comparative theological skills, especially in methods. So we read her article where she explained four virtues, or not virtue, for methods which you can use in comparative theology. So the first thing, what you can learn from comparative theology. The first thing was, as she explained, intensification. And I asked in my class, okay, give me an example for intensification on comparative theology. And I only had Muslim students in this class, only international students from Tunisia, Turkey, and Iran. And Rasul and Nasreen immediately said, okay, that's very easy. Last Sunday, we were at the cathedral in Paderborn, at the Holy Eucharist. And this was the moment we never felt Jesus so close as in that moment. Because you know that for Muslims, Jesus is a very important prophet, especially for Shiites. There's a lot of resonance. And they really felt this is Jesus so close, we never felt this. It's this intensification of the belief in Jesus through the Holy Eucharist. So they didn't take the bread. I told them they should not do that. But it gave them so much spiritual power. The second thing was reinterpretation. Their example for reinterpretation was that they learned so much on the doctrine of Tawhid through taking courses on the Trinity. So this might be weird for you if you don't have had already courses on Christianity, but Christian theologians today are kind of proud of the doctrine of Trinity. For some centuries, Christians were a bit shy and thought it might be a paradox or difficult to understand. But since Hegel, at least in Germany, theologians think that the doctrine of Trinity is the best idea ever invented, and you can solve practically all problems you can imagine with this doctrine. So after having some classes with me on the Trinity, in the end, you really think that you can solve all problems with this, which causes then a problem for a Muslim. How can I solve those problems if I don't have the Trinity? So I tried to help them to find solutions for that, and that gave them new keys to understand Tawhid. And so they said reinterpretation is my reinterpretation of Tawhid through the lens of the Trinity helps me to understand more the dynamic relationship, which is the very essence of God, also in the notion of Tawhid, which is also a dynamic idea, so the idea of Muslim monotheism. The third one is recovery. And Professor Cornell has more of them, even 6, but we only had 4 in that course. So the fourth one was recovery. And there we used in another class a text from Daniel Madigan. And Daniel Madigan has a very beautiful text where he explains the passion of God in his word in the Quran. So usually we think that there is no passion in the Quran of God, no passion, that's only in the gospel, that's something Christian. But I learned from Professor Madigan that all the vocabulary which you can find in the gospel on the passion of Christ can be found in the Quran as the passion of God's word in the Quran. So they said that gave me a new impression of God. God in his mercy and his passion, in his passionate love for humans. That's something we didn't have, which we have in principle in our tradition, but we were not aware of it, so it was a recovery. And the fourth example was very quick. The appropriation was that God is love. They loved that so much. They heard it so many times from me, and they said, that's great. That's not exactly what we learned in our theology, but it fits very well to everything what the Quran says. We are very happy to appropriate that. What was so exciting for me, they said this, like, usually it takes me some time with my Christian students to make them explain these strategies and these methods and to find examples. And they immediately, in the first session, we just read the text and they said, okay, I have my 4 examples. And they went through and they could give more of them. And I could give many more, but I don't want to waste your time with that. But it's really very encouraging to see how the Muslim students coming from Iran, Tunisia, and Turkey, how much they are ready to learn from Christianity, go very deep into Christian theology, and bring this to get a deeper understanding of their own account. So let me end with a very small story. Because I started with Martina and Tuba, so I would like to have the last couple will be Anna and Esak. So one of my Catholic students who has a kind of high position in the Catholic Church today, as high as a woman can have, but high. And Esak Rahnama, a Shiite student, who met in Rome when we were there and fell in love and wanted to marry, which is kind of difficult in this situation because for a Sunni this would be easy, but for a Shi'i this is not possible. You're not allowed as a Shi'i to marry a Christian. So what could we do? And we asked our imams in Iran what could be the solution for them. And then there's a very interesting solution. There is the possibility to have a marriage only for a certain time. But you can choose until 99 years. And then you're allowed to marry anybody, also somebody from another religion. So they had a marriage for 99 years. They're now married since 3 years, and so 96 years to run. And it's a very good example how you can find very pragmatic solutions for legal problems in Islam. I'm very happy that then this is also, I think, a kind of sign of hope for all of us. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be here at BC, which I've visited many times. A great university, a great place, perhaps one of the best places in the world, certainly, I think, to do Catholic theology in English, perhaps in any language. So last year, you had a very fine speaker, Professor Miroslav Volf from Yale University, and perhaps it's a sign of how good Miroslav is that they had to find 3 of us from different parts of the world to try and equal one Miroslav. Or it may be that in the current climate in the world that since we are looking for signs of hope, it takes at least 3 people to find enough to fill an hour and a half. Because, as Professor Cornell said at the beginning, the bad news arrives regularly on our doorsteps every morning, in the newspaper, on our screens, constantly during the day, in 36-point type and full-color photos. The signs of hope are always somewhat like the signs of the kingdom. They sprout like seeds. One looks here, one looks there. The hope that we see in Muslim-Christian relations is, as you will have noticed from what Joshua and Klaus have been talking about, these are all small examples, but from a Christian point of view, those small examples are precisely the way the kingdom of God works, precisely the way God's reign emerges in our world. And these are tender shoots, if you like, which we then try to nurture and protect and help to grow. I mentioned Professor Wolf because I want to use something he spoke about last year to, if you like, put a bit of theory onto what you've been hearing in practice. He talked about CPUs. He was not talking about computers, although that might help you remember the term, CPU. Contending particular universalisms. Contending particular universalisms. This is usually the origin of the bad news that's all around us, is precisely that first letter C, contending. We have been contending with one another as Muslims and Christians in various ways, politically, culturally, theologically, economically, over centuries. And it's the contention that is so much on display from the slides, for example, that Joshua showed us, of the rejection of Muslim immigrants, Muslim refugees coming to Europe, for example, or we see it here in this country. Contention seems to be a problem rather than a cause for hope. What I want to suggest to you is that we are learning ways of contending with one another which are in fact hopeful. We don't have to give up contending. Because people have thought that contention was the big problem, what they did was, okay, C is the problem, so let's deal with the P and the U and see if we can undo the contending. So one way is to say, well, Islam and Christianity and other religious traditions are not in fact universal. They are not in fact universal. And Christians and Muslims used this argument against one another in the early time. Islam, some Christian apologists said, is just for the Arabs. Islam was meant for the Arab pagans, and it doesn't concern us. So Islam is okay, we're not going to argue with you because you are just for Arabs. Many Muslim apologists took the other tack, saying to Christians that in fact Jesus was sent to the people of Israel, and Jesus himself says that at one point in the Gospels. And so therefore his role was not universal in the way Muhammad's role was. Even if Christians argue that Jesus mission was to all humanity and that the message is for all humanity, Jesus was a failure, they say. He did not succeed in creating a universal system of law and observance, a universal obedience to God's will. And so therefore any claim to universality has lapsed with that failure. The idea that you can say to another religious tradition, no, you are not, your claim to have a universal vision, your claim that this message is for all people is rejected. The idea that that will deal with the contentiousness, unfortunately, turned out to be a failure. So there's another way of dealing with it, another way of dealing with these claims to universality. And that is to say, as one does very often in contemporary times, nobody's religion is universal. Nobody's religion is universal. Some people are to be Muslims, and that's fine. Some people can be Christians, that's fine. Some people Hindus, some people Buddhists, some people Confucian, some people Mormon, you name it. There is no such thing as a universal religion. There is no message in any of these proposals which is relevant to everyone and which is urgent for everyone to hear. This goes by the name sometimes of religious pluralism. It's a kind of religious pluralism which really in the end says let as many religions flourish alongside one another as you like, because ultimately none of them has a fully universal claim, and we will only know at the end of time what the truth is. The problem with this, of course, is that our religious traditions are making universal claims. We do think that we have been given an insight, that we have been given revelation, that we have been given some understanding of who God is and what God wants and what God has in store for us. We do believe that what is true about love is not a matter simply of being for one nation or one language group or one racial group. We think that what we know about love is for all people. If it's true for someone who was born in Japan in the 12th century, it's just as true for someone born in Alaska in the 20th century. Humanity is addressed by these, and so none of the religions ultimately will accept the idea that these are simply, if you like, it's a buffet of religions. We all want to say there is a message here, there is an insight here, there is a truth here that it is urgent for all to hear. So the contention was not dealt with that way. Another way is to try and approach the particular, a term that Joshua used in his presentation. If we've got contending particular universalities or universalisms, then maybe we can take the heat out of the contention by addressing the question of particularity. And people try to do that. They say, well, in fact, all these things are the same. None of them is really different. We hear it all the time from very well-meaning people. All religions say that X. Every religion preaches that Y. There is no particularity. It's simply glossed over. But this only works, the denial of the difference among religious traditions and religious proclamations. It only works, really, if you haven't been paying attention. If you actually listen to people about what they believe, if you listen to what people tell you about their most deeply held beliefs and their most passionately held visions of how humanity is to be with God, then it's almost impossible simply to say they're all the same. We end up telling people, well, yes, you may say that, but I really know better than you that what you said you really didn't mean. You mean the same thing as I mean, even though you use different words. There's a certain arrogance to that. So if we are to recognize that religious communities, particularly Muslims and Christians, since that's our topic and that's a very large part of the human family, if we are to accept that we both have really universal claims, we are saying that what we believe about God and humanity is for all people, not just for some, on the basis of color or language group or nationality. If we believe that what people are proposing about God is very particular and is not simply exchangeable for the other version, then how are we to contend? How are we to go ahead recognizing the universal claims, the big U, recognizing the particularity, but contending in a way that doesn't tear our world apart, contending in a way that does not leave a trail of destruction as it has in so many times and places in human history. It's in these stories that you've heard, and I could add other stories of my own, but I won't. What we see is people learning to contend with one another, not simply to agree with one another, not simply to gloss over difference, not simply to say, well, you can say what you like, but what your belief is not important. There is an ability that people find, and they have found through all our history, but it's becoming more urgent in these days, finding ways to take seriously particularity and difference, to take seriously the universal claim, and yet not to come to blows, yet not to. Disagreement is a great gift in some respects. Real disagreement, really understanding what another person is saying, really exploring it until you really have, and the other person feels you really have understood what they're saying, and still to be able to say, I don't agree. I agree with this much or that much or this aspect, but to be able to come to a disagreement without coming to blows is a great gift. And that, I think, is where I see the signs of hope. I see signs of hope in the work that Joshua and Klaus have been doing, which you've heard something about, and I've known them for some years, and we really belong to a kind of a loose network of people who work in this field, Muslim scholars and Christian scholars who are very devoted to this idea of recognizing the particularity of the other, recognizing the universal claim, and yet taking the time and the patience and the commitment that it takes really to live in that contention, really to argue with one another, really to acknowledge difference and explore difference. Professor Cornell mentioned the Building Bridges seminars, which have been going now for 17 years. And they're an example, I think, of a group of scholars, perhaps a network of scholars who've been meeting each year, 4 days each time, studying texts closely, eventually involving one another in their own projects so that the network spreads. It takes time, it takes patience, but the possibility is there. One of the things that makes it possible, I think, is demographic change. For example, in the United States now, perhaps in Europe also, in an earlier period, you didn't have so many Muslims who were involved in religious studies, because many Muslims were immigrants. And of course their parents, if they told their parents after high school that they wanted to go into religious studies, the parents were horrified. They had to go to law school, or they had to become doctors or engineers. What's the point of going into religion? But it's become the case in the last few decades that Muslims are going into the Religious Studies Academy. And so we're not blocked in our mutual understanding, we're not blocked in our peaceful contention by huge differences of academic culture. We're not blocked by the fact that the person we are talking with about religion is in fact an engineer rather than a religious studies person. There's been an imbalance for a long time that the Christian scholars of Islam have unbalanced, if you like, this relationship, not for any bad reason, but now it becomes possible for us to meet on a more solid ground. And Joshua and Klaus are both involved in that. I taught, as Catherine said, for quite a number of years in Rome, and quite a number of Muslim students who came there to study experienced the hospitality of seminaries, of centers, they experienced the hospitality of cardinals and bishops and others, and they offered their own hospitality, and that hospitality is a key to what we're talking about. There's an intellectual hospitality, but the intellectual hospitality, in a sense, has to be mirrored by the kind of table spread that Joshua showed us from Greece. There's a human hospitality, which is partly intellectual, but also very physical. I just want to add one more thing, which perhaps is a little counterintuitive. One place where I see a glimmer of hope is in the current bad news. The current bad news that, Boston went through this in a big way in 2002, but the rest of the church in the US is catching up with Boston. Perhaps that's always the case, Boston leading the way. But the humiliation of the church's shame on display for all to see, I see in there a moment of possibility, because one of the things which has bedeviled our contending with one another about our universal visions of what God is doing and how it is to be human under God, one of the things that has bedeviled us is a certain arrogance and moral superiority. In this day and age, the Catholic Church, many churches, have no moral superiority left, if we are honest. And the kind of humility that is perhaps forced upon us now is an opening. And Muslims too have had their own humiliations, particularly in recent years with the catastrophe of ISIS, for example, claiming to act on behalf of the Muslim community, claiming to be the new caliphate. the kind of failure to do justice, to make peace, and so on, is a humiliation for many Muslims. If we can let go of our moral superiority in these current circumstances, if we can acknowledge that real Muslims and real Christians are not in fact ideal, that we are in various ways failures, maybe then we can come to an attitude of humility towards one another. And that attitude of humility, as Professor Cornell has written so eloquently in her own work, is an essential part of interreligious relation. So, counterintuitively, perhaps, I see in our current moment of shame a glimmer of possibility, a glimmer of hope, because we are brought low, and from the low point, maybe we can build up. Thank you.
So we have about 20 minutes for dialogue and discussion, for questions. There are 2 microphones in the middle of the room that you can go to if you have any thoughts or questions that you want to present. As you are thinking about it, I want to give the panelists themselves a chance, maybe if they have anything to add to one another, or questions to ask to one another, to open the floor by giving them the floor again to engage one another. Otherwise, the microphones are there if you want to pose a question or make a comment. No? All right, so the floor is open.
Good afternoon, thank you. I wanted to ask about, you've shared with us a number of dialogues, theoretical, but also more practical relationships. And I'm wondering if you could comment on how we bring soteriological discussions into these relationships and into this theoretical work. Because hospitality in this life is of course important, but if we, how accountable can we be to people who, if we imagine that they will not be with us in the next world? And certainly I say that with the knowledge that certainly not all Christians and not all Muslims make an exclusive claim to the next world. But how do we take those kinds of conversations into account?
So, from a Catholic point of view, that's very easy, because since Nostra Aetate, it's clear that there's salvation also outside the church through Jesus Christ, but also outside the church, so also for Muslims and people of other religions. The Muslims I'm in dialogue with would argue in the same way. From a Muslim point of view, you can say that Jesus and the apostles are called Muslims, for example, in the Quran. So you can find arguments to say that a person who is submitted to God is a Muslim in some sense. And so there will be salvation also for Christians from a Muslim point of view. That's what they say. If you don't believe that, or if you think that your dialogue partner will go to hell, yeah, well, then it's a bit difficult to have also to learn from each other. And so I haven't made this experience in dialogue. I made it though in Jerusalem when I wanted to enter the temple of the rock. They told me, you won't go here because you're a Christian. You can now taste a little bit how it is, not in the hereafter. You won't go to heaven. Now you won't go to the temple of the rock. But this was not a moment when I wanted to do a theological dialogue. At least he didn't want to argue with me.
Yeah, I think it is true that both traditions, we each have our ways of understanding how it might be possible for the other to be saved, even though there seems to be some kind of condition in the way many people express it. But both traditions have relied on this sense that, well, in the Catholic tradition we call it invincible ignorance, which doesn't mean that these people are stupid particularly. What it means is the truth about what God wants somehow is not available to them. And it may well be that the reason the truth is not available to them is precisely because of the bad that Christians have done. If Christians had actually lived the gospel, then everyone would see, yes, clearly this is a real human life. This is the truth about God and humanity. But given the way that Christians have failed to embody this, then even if you think that people ought to be Christian, is it their fault, or is it the fault of the Christians that they're not seeing the truth there? So it's a not knowing that, and it's a not knowing that it's almost impossible to overcome. And the reason it's impossible to overcome it is precisely because of our own Christian failings. And there are Muslim thinkers who have used the same move. They say, well, how can someone who rejects the prophethood of Muhammad, how can that person be right with God? And they answer the question by saying, well, many of these people have never really understood the prophethood of Muhammad. They've been brought up on a diet of cartoons and polemics, and people have said the most terrible things about Muhammad to them, and so of course they don't believe in the prophethood of Muhammad. If they had heard the truth, if they had seen the truth of Muhammad, then you might say that their rejection was culpable. But most people don't get the chance, they would say. So, we both in our traditions have this fundamental sense that God's mercy and the possibilities are much bigger than the conditions we might set.
I guess I'll say something. I remember in 2012 when I was teaching at a Protestant seminary in Richmond, Virginia, I ended up having a conversation with a young Saudi boy, and it was the opposite experience, because he said, how do you know so much about Islam and you're not a Muslim? So I didn't have the ignorant excuse. And maybe some Catholics would say the same. If I know so much about the Catholic teaching, why am I not a Catholic? But I think for me, dialogue and evangelism, to use that word, don't necessarily have to be in competition. If the point isn't to win an argument, but to give an account, or what I talk about in some of my work is bearing witness, not as an attempt to convert the other person necessarily, but of creating the conceptual space for giving an authentic account of the hope that is within us, to give a Christian argument. One of the theologians that's most influential for me, oddly, given his disdain for interreligious dialogue, is Karl Barth, who says that any divinity which needs human propaganda is no God at all. And so what we're doing when we're engaging is not human propaganda to convince someone else who's not a real person, but we're engaging in a pattern of mutual exchange and mutual witness. And in my own Reformed tradition, the agent of conversion is not argumentation, but the Holy Spirit. And similarly, in the Islamic tradition, especially Naveed Kermani's book, which Klaus introduced me to, God is Beautiful, it talks about what converts someone is the beauty of the Quran. It's the encounter with it. I don't own that. I can give an account of that, and dialogue may do that. and dialogue may do that to me. So I think you have to have an eschatological reserve to say, I don't know, I have a hope, but as the Quran itself says, when we return to God, God will inform us about the things we disagreed about.
Excuse me. Bismillah, the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. My name is Walid Muhammad. I'm the Muslim chaplain at the Norfolk Prison in Norfolk, Massachusetts. It was the prison that Malcolm X was in, last in, and I heard about the program. This is the second time coming here. A previous time, a few of us chaplains from the Massachusetts Department of Correction came here, and I wanted to commend you all for such a program, commend those who made the program possible. And I like the title. It was one thing that attracted me to come here, the Signs of Hope in Muslim-Christian Relations. That's very important, I think. I want to mention how about 14 centuries ago, there were a couple of migrations, which migrations are a big thing in the news today here in this country. Well, migrations were important 14 centuries ago, where a band of Muslims had to leave Mecca and journey to Abyssinia, as it was called then, now known as Ethiopia, to meet with a king, a Christian king by the name of Negus, who accepted the Muslims and protected them because no doubt they would have been killed. And so that was a very important moment in the time of history. And I think these kinds of things need to be known and brought out. And the fact that we need to work on the positive things, the things that we have in common, because a lot of times the contention is about what I think was brought up before, who's right and who's wrong. But we need to get to know each other, which is mentioned in the Quran as a very important step for all of us to get to know each other, because oftentimes people make judgments and they don't even know a thing about another person. All they see is the color, or all that they see is the size, or whatever it may be. So it's the positive things that count. And so I appreciate such an opportunity as this, and I think we should keep having such programs so that we can have very important dialogue and not to just contend with each other to see who is right and see who is wrong. And that's not the way of dialogue, in my opinion. So thank you very much. Appreciate all the comments. And I hope to return again for another program.
Thank you.
Just briefly, I really appreciate you bringing up the story about Abyssinia and Muslims. What's interesting is it also relates to both what Klaus and what Dan were saying, because as the story's told, right, you have this space in which the Christian king gives hospitality that allows the Muslim community safety and ultimately to flourish. But you also have this story where he draws a line in the sand and says, all that separates us from you is this line of the sand, which is actually our understanding of Jesus. And it was this space in which particularity, contending particulars, also was done in a space of socio-political engagement. So it's one of the first moments, but it's also one that resonates with both the stories that Dan and Klaus were saying.
Maybe one remark also from me, because in the Muslim tradition, as you certainly know, the Surah Maryam, the 19th Surah, is understood as being revealed in the time when the this, what you explained to us, happened. So that the Surah Maryam is a kind of helping those first Muslims to be welcomed by the Christian king. And it's interesting, if you read the Surah Maryam with this in mind, it's interesting that it's a very beautiful story of the birth of Jesus. So if Christmas is coming, you should read Surah Maryam. It's really a very beautiful story. But there's just one passage which seems to be polemical, which wouldn't make polemical against Christians, which wouldn't make sense if you have this historical setting in mind. But if you have a deeper look at those verses, it's interesting when the verse 35 in the Surah Maryam says, don't say that Jesus is the Son of God. The Arab term here is not what Christians say, Ibn, but it's walad, what pagan Arabs would say, who include Jesus in the pantheon in Mecca. So sometimes in dialogue there we can have misunderstanding. It's important to have a very close look at what is really in the text to avoid those misunderstandings. And the historical setting can be so helpful to know what is the historical background of the scene, not to misunderstand it. So thank you for your intervention.
Hi. So I was just wondering, specifically Klaus, you were talking about your students and how a lot of your Muslim students were very open-minded and willing to learn from Christianity and sort of get a new perspective. So I was wondering how you think that we can help Christian individuals sort of be more ready and willing and able to learn from Islam in a similar way.
Yeah, so I always started with Christian students and helping them how we can learn from Islam. I also tried to write a book on this, and all my examples usually go in that direction. So now I focused the other direction to show, because usually people ask me, well, okay, we learned so much from Islam, but the Muslims never learned something from us. So I wanted today to show to you, no, we also have the other direction. Now it's interesting that you ask me, okay, what about the Christians? Are they willing to learn? Yeah, I could deliver another speech and try to give examples for that.
Yeah,
and also,
I feel like a lot of Americans sort of feel like learning about Islam isn't not that it's not important, but it's not super relevant to their lives because Christianity is so prominent in this country. So that's sort of why I asked. But.
Yeah, let me try to give two examples. So one example is on the Trinity again. So when I taught a course on the Trinity, the basic reaction of most of the students was that they didn't want to know it so exactly. The texts were too complicated for them, especially Hegel. So then I decided to make another course on the Trinity and Tawhid, together with my Muslim colleague and Christian and Muslim students. The same complicated Christian texts, but we only had the half of the time for the Trinity, the other half for Tawhid, for the Muslim idea. The result was that the Christian students learned more about the Trinity than in the other course. And the reason was very simple. When the first Christian student raised his arm and said, whoa, why should I read Hegel? Nobody can understand that. Then the Muslim student said, okay, I have a solution for you. I know a religion where you don't have to read this stuff. So come over. And what was interesting, the Christian students didn't want to come over, but they felt okay, I really have to understand it and to explain it to my Muslim students. So even if you think you have everything, I think you will find also in the United States some Christians who have difficulties to explain the Trinity, maybe, or they have weird ideas of the Trinity. Maybe this is helpful to go in dialogue. And the other example is just what Joshua mentioned now. What was so fascinating for me when I first read the Quran is simply the beauty of its recitation. So if you encounter that for Muslims, the beauty of the recitation is an encounter with God, that hearing the Quran means hearing the voice of God, and that this is showing something to us of the beauty of God, that helped me to get a new attitude towards the beauty of my own liturgy. When I was raised as a young man, as a Catholic, I was more one of those Catholics who liked so much these new music, like pop music in church. I don't know if you have something like this in America, but that's was I was raised. Today I would say it was a disaster, but always Jesus pop songs and Jesus is your healer, like evangelicals basically. But I don't want to offend anybody. But then I didn't have so much appreciation for very traditional liturgy. And through seeing this kind of recitation of the Quran, I got a fresh look on my own liturgy. And so it's not, you learn something on yourself if you encounter another religion. So even if you think in America there are only Christians, what is not true, but even if this was true, you can learn on Christianity through encounters.
Thank you.
Hi, this question is directed to Daniel Madigan. So during your talk, you said that it's very difficult in this time, in this day and age, to come to religious discussions without coming to blows. And you said that one of the things that we lacked was patience and commitment to actually have these conversations without getting into, some sort of heated debate that, we can really see here in America. What do you think happened in our society that we failed to develop that kind of mindset or framework to come to discussions in a civilized way where we can accept the other person's viewpoint and also offer our own at the same time?
Well, I think you know what the result will be. I wanted to explore a little this question of do we accept what the other person says? What does that mean to accept what the other person says? We often talk about the only way we can have a real dialogue is if you accept that what I say is true and I'll accept what you say is true. But because we are talking about two particular religions which are not in fact saying the same thing, it is not possible to accept necessarily what the other person is saying. I don't expect my Muslim students to accept what I say about Trinity, and so I think we need to be a little more careful about the idea of accepting what the other person says. We use the term kind of very, very loosely, as though you're not taking me seriously unless you accept what I say. I will try to understand what you say. I will, with patience and goodwill and generosity, I will try and understand what you say and why you believe it, and I will explore that as much as possible. But there's a difference between doing that and simply accepting. So I think the key to what we're looking for is how to disagree without coming to blows. Rowan Williams, who I think 2 years ago gave this lecture, he likes to talk about the improving the quality of our disagreements. That's what we do when Muslims and Christians engage one another, and it's true of other religious traditions as well. We don't come to an agreement necessarily because we are simply not saying the same thing. If we were to come to an agreement, then it would mean one of us has converted, perhaps. But he said to improve the quality of our disagreements, to know precisely what the other person means and why I disagree with that. So I'm not. I'm not in favor of agreement necessarily. I'm in favor of understanding.
Exactly.
Does that help?
Yeah. Thank you.
I think our time has come to an end. I want to close by just remembering the image that you brought up, Professor Madigan, of signs of hope as small seeds that we can all plant in our daily life and in our context, and that are the beginning of the kingdom and that we all can contribute to. So I want to thank you again for coming and sharing with us. I want to thank you all, and I wish you a good evening.